Saturday, March 25, 1911, seemed like an ordinary workday. The workers, many of them as young as 14, were nearing the end of their shift, eager to return home to their families. The factory floor buzzed with activity. Rows of women hunched over sewing machines, surrounded by piles of fabric and scraps that littered the floor. But beneath this seemingly mundane scene, the factory was a powder keg waiting to ignite. By the early 1900s, New York City had cemented itself as the industrial heartbeat of America, and at the center of this rapid urban growth was the garment industry. Factories sprang up across the city, driven by the insatiable demand for ready-made clothing, especially for women. Fashion had evolved in this period with the rise of the shirtwaist blouse, a simple yet stylish garment that became a symbol of modern womanhood. As the industry boomed, it became reliant on a cheap and plentiful labor force. Mostly immigrant workers, many of whom were young women recently arrived from Italy, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Drawn by the promise of opportunity, they found themselves crammed into poorly ventilated, overcrowded, and often unsafe sweatshops, toiling long hours for meager pay. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, located on the top 3 floors of the 10-story ash building near Washington Square, was emblematic of this thriving but dangerous industry. Owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris, themselves immigrants, the factory employed over 500 workers at its peak. The factory was well known for producing shirtwaists, but it was also notorious for its unsafe working conditions. Labor laws were limited at the time, and many owners, including Blank and Harris, flouted even the minimal safety regulations that did exist. The factory had no sprinklers or fire alarms, the fire escapes were inadequate, and, most infamously, the doors were often locked during working hours, a practice meant to prevent theft, but which had deadly consequences. Saturday, March 25, 1911, seemed like an ordinary workday. The workers, many of them as young as 14, were nearing the end of their shift, eager to return home to their families. The factory floor buzzed with activity. Rows of women hunched over sewing machines, surrounded by piles of fabric and scraps that littered the floor. But beneath this seemingly mundane scene, the factory was a powder keg waiting to ignite. At approximately 4:40 p.m., a fire started on the 8th floor, likely sparked by a discarded cigarette or match that ignited the fabric scraps. The fire spread with alarming speed, fed by the highly flammable cotton, tissue paper patterns, and dust that filled the air. Within moments, the fire engulfed the room, and workers realized they were in grave danger. Panic set in almost immediately. People scrambled for the exits, but their options were severely limited. Flames quickly blocked the main stairwell, trapping workers on the upper floors. A bookkeeper named Margaret Schwartz was one of the first to respond to the growing chaos. Realizing the severity of the situation, she rushed to the telephone and managed to contact workers on the 10th floor, where the factory's owners, Blank and Harris, were working. Her quick actions allowed those on the top floor to escape to the roof, where they were able to reach safety by climbing across ladders that were extended by students from a nearby New York University building. Blank and Harris, despite their culpability in the disaster, were among those who escaped. On the 9th floor, however, the situation was far more dire. The warning never reached them, and by the time the workers became aware of the fire, smoke and flames were already filling the room. Chaos erupted as they rushed for the exits, only to discover that many of the doors were locked. The factory had 2 main stairways, one leading to Green Street and another to Washington Place, but the Washington Place door was bolted shut, a measure meant to prevent theft. The foreman who held the key had already escaped, leaving the workers with no means of unlocking it. The fire quickly reached the stairwells, and those attempting to flee found themselves trapped. workers packed into the freight elevators in a desperate attempt to escape. Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillaro, the elevator operators, risked their lives by making multiple trips to the ninth floor, rescuing dozens of workers. But after a few trips, the heat from the fire warped the elevator rail, forcing them to stop. Some workers, driven by desperation, pried open the elevator doors and jumped into the shafts, clinging to the cables in an attempt to save themselves. Tragically, most fell to their deaths, their bodies crashing into the elevator car below, which was further damaged by the impact. With no other escape routes available, many workers turned to the fire escape on the exterior of the building. The fire escape, however, was a poorly constructed, flimsy structure that was only loosely attached to the building. It quickly became overcrowded as dozens of workers tried to flee the inferno. The fire escape, unable to support the weight of so many people, collapsed under the pressure, sending about 20 workers plunging nearly 100 feet to their deaths in the alley below. The remaining workers inside were faced with an unimaginable decision: stay and burn or jump from the windows. As the fire raged on, more and more workers began to leap from the 9th and 10th floors, their bodies smashing into the sidewalk in front of horrified onlookers. William Gunn Shepard, a journalist who witnessed the scene, later recalled that the sound of the bodies hitting the ground was more horrible than description can picture. The fire department arrived quickly, but their ladders only reached the 6th floor, well below the burning floors where workers were trapped. Firefighters tried in vain to catch the jumpers with life nets, but the force of the falling bodies was too great, and the nets tore apart. By 5 p.m., just 18 minutes after the fire began, it had largely burned itself out. But the damage was done. A total of 146 people, 129 women and 17 men were dead, most of them killed by the fall from the upper floors or trapped by the locked doors inside. Their bodies were strewn across the sidewalk or piled near the exits that had been blocked. Survivors described the scenes of carnage as unimaginable. Piles of charred bodies, twisted in their final moments, huddled near the locked doors they had desperately tried to escape through. The aftermath of the fire sent shock waves through the city and the nation. News of the tragedy spread quickly, and the public was outraged. How could so many lives have been lost in a matter of minutes? The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire quickly became a symbol of the dangers that workers, particularly immigrant women, faced in the growing industrial economy. Protest marches were held, and labor activists, many of whom had already been fighting for better working conditions, seized on the disaster to push for reforms. An investigation into the fire revealed the factory's numerous safety violations: locked doors, inadequate fire escapes, no sprinklers, and an overall lack of regard for worker safety. Despite the public outcry, Blank and Harris were acquitted of manslaughter charges. The defense argued that there was insufficient evidence to prove they had intentionally locked the doors on the day of the fire. However, they did collect a large insurance payout, much more than what they paid to the victims' families. Although Blank and Harris escaped criminal responsibility, the fire became a turning point for labor laws in the United States. In the wake of the tragedy, New York State formed the Factory Investigating Commission to examine working conditions across the state. The findings of the commission led to the enactment of significant safety reforms, including mandatory fire drills, the installation of sprinklers in large factories, and the requirement that exit doors remain unlocked during working hours. These regulations became a model for other states, and eventually many of the laws passed in the aftermath of the Triangle Fire laid the groundwork for federal workplace safety standards. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is remembered today not just for its tragedy, but for the lasting changes it spurred. The 146 lives lost that day are commemorated in annual ceremonies and memorials, a reminder of the sacrifices made by those workers. The fire remains one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history, and its legacy continues to shape workplace safety and labor rights to this day.